Parshas, we are doing Parshas Shlach Lecha this evening, and as we know, the portion of Shlach Lecha, it starts with the Bamidbar Yud Gimel, Numbers chapter 13, is dominated by the tragic incident of the spies. I would say that the Chet HaEgel, the sin of the golden calf, and the Chet HaMeragli, and the sin of the spies, are the two great tragedies that befell the Jewish people during their time in the wilderness. And of course, it's the second of them, the one for tonight, which extended their time in the desert, as we know, by, I guess, about 38 years or more, making 40 years in the wilderness altogether, as is very well known. I want to start at the beginning with a very interesting thought, actually two approaches to the comment of Rashi at the beginning of the parsha. So it begins chapter 13, verse 1. Hashem spoke to Moshe, telling him, Shlach lecha anashim, send for yourself people, men, v'yasuru es eretz Canaan, and they shall tour or spy out the land of Canaan. Asher nosen livnei Yisrael, that I'm giving to the children of Israel. Ish echad lamateh avosaf tishlachu kol nasi vahem. Each tribe, one representative, each of them a prince, each of them a leader, a person of stature. Now, as we know, it ends in grief, in catastrophe, and many of the Mefarshim deal with the question, which I suppose is the obvious question: why? Why did they do it? What was the purpose of it? Did they really need it? Why did they even think that they needed to undertake such a mission? But Rashi initially takes up a kind of contextual question. Rashi, I hope you have Rashi's Perush there with you. It's very useful for any student of Chumash to have Rashi available as well. Shlach lecha anashim, says Rashi, lama nisbacha parshas meraglim parshas Miriam. Why is this chapter, why is this subject juxtaposed? Why does it appear here immediately after the incident of Miriam? Of course, Miriam, the reference to Miriam is Miriam and Aharon, the two elder siblings of Moshe, were found to be talking about Moshe. Miriam was speaking, Aaron was listening. They were both complicit in this instance of Lashon Hara. It's one of the classic examples of Lashon Hara in all of Jewish literature, in all of the Tanakh, and very well known. And of course, Miriam was punished despite the many mitigating circumstances, her own righteousness, the fact that it was only in private, that is to say, it was all in the family, just Miriam and Aharon. They were talking about Moshe, their younger brother, and many other mitigating circumstances. Nevertheless, she was punished severely by it. Says Rashi, that's why they juxtaposed, because the people will have known what happened to Miriam. The she was smitten, she was struck with tsaras, leprosy, or something similar to leprosy, as a result of speaking about her brother. And these men, these 12 spies, at least 10 of the 12, because 2 of them were righteous, but of the other 10, Rishaim Halalu, these wicked people, they saw and they didn't get the message. They didn't get the memo. They didn't respond. They didn't recognize, or they didn't take it to heart. And they committed the same or a similar kind of transgression a short while after. That's why they're juxtaposed. That's what Rashi says. So Rabbi Yosef has 2 approaches to this. I want to start with actually what he mentions as the second one, but for our purpose, I think it's closer to the Pshat, and I'd like to start with that. So he asks, why didn't they send the spies earlier? Now, for us, reading the Chumash, we start with Bereshis, Shmos, Vayikra. We're already in our way through Bamidbar, so we feel as if the narrative of the Torah is approaching the conclusion already. But actually, if we think about it, there was an opportunity for them to send spies much earlier. I suppose it's consistent with the observation I've just made. They could have sent the spies as soon as they got the Torah or shortly thereafter. Even with the Chet HaEgel, if they were going to enter the land of Israel, they could have sent sooner. They could have sent it while they were building the Mishkan, or even if not then, by the time they were told to move on from Har Sinai, they could have dispatched the spies immediately. So Rabbi Yosef says, actually, there's a reason why they did not send the spies earlier. There's a reason why they only sent them now. And that is that in last week's Parsha, we read about the complaints about the manna from heaven. They were not happy with it. They protested about it. They complained about it. And Moshe took it very personally. Moshe reacts in an uncharacteristic way in which he says to God, how can I provide for these people? And Hashem says, I will appoint 70 elders and I also provide meat for them. The relationship between the two is that Moshe was too high. He was too exalted. He was too spiritually great for the people. They wanted someone closer to them. The man is in the merit of Moshe. When they were unhappy with the man, when they rejected the man, it was a rejection of Moshe. And as a result of that, the 70 elders were appointed. And as the Torah says explicitly, there were actually 72 selected, that is 6 times 12, 6 from each tribe. But they only needed 70. So there were 2 who were excluded, who were not necessary because only 70 were chosen. But those 2 were among the greatest. They were very humble and they were great in their own right. And the Torah says explicitly, Eldad Umedad prophesied in the camp. What the Torah does not say is exactly what was their prophecy. But we know that the prophecy was upsetting to Yehoshua. He said, Adoni Moshe Kalaim, etc. So Rashi says there in last week's parsha that their prophecy was a very fateful and consequential prophecy, a prophecy that would be fulfilled before long. And that is Moshe Meis, Yehoshua Machnisam La'aretz. Moshe will die, Yehoshua will bring them into the land of Israel. That's why Yehoshua objected, because he was embarrassed that they were prophesying that his great master Moshe Rabbeinu was going to die, and that he, Yehoshua, would be the one to fulfill the mission for which Moshe had been destined. But of course, that's exactly what happened, and that is exactly what was now destined to happen. Says Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, we already know that although they complained about Moshe, they had a lot of trust in Moshe as well. The pasuk says, "V'yaminu v'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo." When the sea split, the people were very impressed. They're not easy to impress the Jewish people, but then they were talking impressed. They believed in God and in his servant Moshe. That means that the people trusted in Moshe. The people relied on Moshe. Moshe had a lot of credibility in the eyes of the people because he took them out of Egypt with miracles and supernatural events. So the people thought Moshe is on a roll. He's going to take us into the land of Canaan as well. Actually, when they thought Moshe was gone, they panicked. They said, what happened to Moshe? Kuma Seilanu Elohim. That's why they made the golden calf. But when they realized their error, when they realized that Moshe was still with them, when they realized that Moshe was still the leader of the nation, they thought, with the leadership of Moshe, we don't need Meraglim, we don't need spies, we don't need military tactics even. We're going to just walk right in. If Moshe, as the representative of Hashem, enabled us to leave Egypt when we were enslaved for generations, the great superpower of the world, and we left without having to exert ourselves, without having to even imperil ourselves, because it was a miraculous way. The same will happen for Canaan. That's why they only sent the Meraglim now, because in last week's parsha they learned, as we just said, Moshe will die, Yehoshua will bring him into the land. They thought, hey, if Yehoshua is going to bring us into the land, then we're going to need military tactics, strategy. We need to know what we're up against. Until then, until that prophecy of Eldad Umedad, they didn't need any Meraglim. They did not need any spies at all. Of course, as we know, it ended in tragedy, and it was wrong to send the spies altogether. Because Hashem has still delivered his promise, and the people still should have trusted in Hashem. But we can understand that once they learned that Moshe is going to die, so they felt the need for spies. Actually, Ramban says something, well, it's not exactly similar, but the observation of Ramban is consistent with what we just said right now. Ramban says that the reason they send spies is because of the overarching principle, Ein Somchen al Hanes. We don't rely on miracles. The Torah, even where great miracles happen, but there's an expectation that a person, even the Jewish people, even this generation in the wilderness, will exert themselves, will apply human agency and endeavor to succeed in the best way that they can without relying on Hashem to do, so to speak, all of the miracles on their behalf. And that was the justification for sending the spies. But certainly, according to this observation of Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, that the people trusted in Moshe, but now they learn Moshe is going to die. That's why they need to send the spies. I want to tell you the other thing he says, though, which is a very strong question, which he asks, and I'll tell you his answer as well. So the Rashi says, Lama nisbacha, why is this juxtaposed? Says Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, what is going on with this question? This question of the juxtaposition of two passages or two chapters or two subjects is in place where they seem to be unrelated, where the two subjects, and the Torah is full of such instances, appear to have no natural connection, where the two mitzvahs that are apparently unrelated, or two narrative events, or a set of mitzvahs on a certain subject, and then the Torah, so to speak, turns to another subject, switches gear. Then Rashi and the Mefarshim will ask, Lama nisbacha, why are they juxtaposed? And there's always an answer. We learn something from the juxtaposition. Says Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, this question is not a matter of the Miriam incident and the spies' mission. Why? If you turn the page back, I don't know what Chumash you're using, but if you look immediately at the previous pasuk, it says Va'achar, after the very end of the Miriam parsha, Va'achar nasu ha'am mechatzeros, v'yachanu b'midbar Paran. After that, they left Chatzeros and they settled and they encamped in Midbar Paran, in the Paran desert. The spies were sent from the Paran desert. So Rav Yonasan Eibshitz asked, it's just a chronological narration. The chapter about sending the spies is here because that is when it happened. The immediate previous verse says that they encamped in Paran and they send the spies from Paran. So says Rav Yonasan Eibshitz, the question doesn't really begin. There's no need for some midrashic or philosophical or even text-based nuance that we need to explore to understand why they're juxtaposed. They're juxtaposed because that's when the incident happened. That's where it happened, and that's when it happened. They encamped in Paran, and they send the spies from Paran. Now, I would add that according to Rashi, there is still a bit of a question, because as we know, Rashi, this is for the scholars in the group, Rashi endorses the principle, Ein mukdam umuachar b'Torah. There is no earlier and later in the Torah. In other words, the Torah follows an order. The order is not always evident, but it is not necessarily a chronological order. So according to Rashi, even if something happens sequentially, we still need an explanation why the Torah mentions it here, because we know that the Torah frequently is not particular about arranging passages in chronological order. But that's just parenthetical. Let me tell you his answer. He answers, I think, very well. He says the Jewish people had the idea about sending spies, but they were reluctant to do so because they suspected, or they had maybe a premonition, or maybe they just wanted to be cautious and they were worried. When we send these spies, who knows if they will bring back a faithful report, a loyal report, an objective report. Maybe they'll have their own agenda for their own reasons. They'll sabotage the whole enterprise, which of course is exactly what happened. They were worried, the Jewish people were worried, they may defame, they may malign the land of Israel for whatever the reason. And actually the Mefarshim struggled to explain what was the reason. Maybe because these Nisiim, these princes, had positions of prominence, of eminence, of authority, of prestige in the wilderness. When they enter the land of Israel, it's all going to be changed. So it suited them to keep the status quo. But for whatever the reason, the Jewish people were suspicious, were worried about that. That's why they said, we're not sending spies. It's not a good idea. Then when Miriam committed her terrible indiscretion, for which she was punished, for which reason the Jewish people were delayed by 7 days to wait for her to recover from her leprosy before they moved on. So it was an event that everyone was aware of. Therefore, the people thought, you know what, now it's safe to send these spies. Because having seen what we have all seen, I'll just read you a few words. He says, Vadai lo yechazvu l'hotzi diba al Eretz Yisrael. Having seen this event, having seen the consequences of Miriam's indiscretion, Certainly, they will not distort, they will not corrupt, they will not sabotage the program of entering the land by maligning the land of Israel. They definitely won't do that because they've seen the consequences. And that's why their sin was so grievous. That's why their transgression was so villainous, because they had just seen, not according to Amos, and actually it wasn't just that the Torah arranges it that way in order to hint to this lesson. It's much more than that. It's only because of what happened to Miriam that the Jewish people collectively now we have the confidence, because certainly right after what happened to Miriam, they're not going to repeat or even commit a more grievous transgression, still having seen what happened to Miriam. And that's why their punishment was so intense. You can compare it as I once read a little parable, probably, of a technician in a hospital who was careless, and he failed to check or to prepare or to manage properly an expensive piece of machinery. And as a result, it was badly damaged. It cost $50,000 to repair it. So the next day, his boss called him in to the office, and the guy thought, it's curtains for me. I'm going to get my walking papers on the spot. So the director of the hospital looked at him solemnly, and he said, why didn't you check that equipment properly? How could you be so careless? So he expressed himself in the best way he could, apologizing, in a wholehearted manner. And the director of the hospital said, you've got to be more careful in the future. So he was astonished. You're not going to fire me? So the director of the hospital said, I just spent $50,000 teaching you a lesson you'll never forget. Now I should fire you. But according to this little allegory, what if the next week he did commit the same error, the same carelessness? Then, it would be curtains for him for certain. So that's what happened here. Lama Nisbacha Parsha, why was it juxtaposed? Because it was that was the opportune juncture when they sent the spies so that they would have learned a lesson. When they did not learn the lesson, then of course the consequences were catastrophic indeed. Let's go on to another quite well-known and I guess interesting passage, one pasuk actually, and that is the observation that after the Torah enumerates the names of the 12 representatives, one from each tribe. Actually, the tribe of Levi did not have a representative because we have Ephraim and Manasseh separately. But in any case, there were 12 tribes, 12 spies. One of them was called Hoshea bin Nun. He was from the tribe of Ephraim. And the Torah says at the end of this short passage, verse 16, Pasuk Tezayin, verse 16, these are the names of the men that Moshe sent to spy out the land. Vaikra Moshe leHoshea bin Nun Yehoshua. And Moshe called Hoshea by the name Yehoshua. That's interesting. He's mostly known as Yehoshua in the Torah. His name appears earlier as well. He's always called Yehoshua. But evidently, he's called Yehoshua in the Torah because Moshe changed his name, but his original name was Hoshea. So even though his name is only changed here, but when his name appears elsewhere in the Torah, he's normally called Yehoshua. But that evidently, we learn here, is the name that Moshe bestowed upon him. So Rashi says that he called him Yehoshua without explaining why. I mean, I'm sorry. The Torah says he called him Yehoshua. He changed his name from Hoshea to Yehoshua without explaining why. Rashi says that that by adding the Yud, Moshe incorporated the name of God into the name of this Yehoshua or Hoshea. Hoshea means to save. Yehoshua means may God save. And Rashi says, may God save you from the plot, from the influence, from the nefarious influence of the spies. The nefarious plot, let's say, Rashi says, of the spies. The Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, now just want to add a word, the classic, very well-known translation of the Chumash is that of Onkelos. It's printed in many chumashim, possibly the one you have in front of you right now. And Onkelos was one of the great sages of the era of the Mishnah. He has a fascinating backstory, but that's not for now. And his translation is generally al derech hapshat. Generally, it just renders the Hebrew into a felicitous Aramaic. Inevitably, there's valuable commentary in it as well, but usually he does not elaborate midrashically. Occasionally he does, but usually not. There's another Targum, another translation into Aramaic from broadly the same era, attributed to Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. Now, the attribution is a bit doubtful, in fact, but it is an ancient Aramaic, authoritative rabbinic Aramaic translation, which also has a lot of midrashic elaboration as well. So these two Targumim are very useful, and the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, as I said, often contains within it midrashic elaboration. So he explains in the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel, called Jonathan or Pseudo-Jonathan in the scholarly English literature, it says, Ukedechama Moshe an v'sanuse shel Hosea, when Moshe saw the humility of Hosea, Kara lo Yehoshua. He called him Yehoshua. Evidently, it was because of his humility. Now, was it a kind of accolade because of his humility, or was it something a bit more sharper edge, that because of his humility, Moshe realized there was a need to couple the name of Hosea with the name of God? You call him Yehoshua. So Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz is the same Yonasan. Rabbi Yonasan Eibshitz says that when he explains as follows, that when Moshe saw that Yehoshua was embarrassed by this prophecy that Moshe will die, Yehoshua will succeed Moshe as the leader of the nation, he will bring them into the land of Israel. When Moshe saw that Yehoshua was upset by it, that he was embarrassed by it, in other words, he wasn't celebrating the news that he's going to succeed the great leader of Israel, he's going to be the leader of the next generation, then even though he had divine, not just permission, but it was divine authority, according to this prophecy, when Moshe saw how reluctant Yehoshua was, so therefore he called him by the name of God. He added the yud to his name, Yehoshua. I would like to explain possibly what it means. Humility is not only an important trait, it's an essential trait. And the opposite of humility, arrogance, is a terrible blight, and not something time to talk about that. But humility has a downside as well. A person who is humble, a person who has, let's say, who's not inclined to assert his view and to impose his opinion on others, such a person is vulnerable to the influence of others. And in particular, Yehoshua is one out of 12. And even though Kalev was also righteous, but the other 10 were not. Moshe may have known it, may have suspected it. I mean, he probably would have known these people who were righteous, it has to be said, at the time, but nevertheless, Moshe may have realized there is danger afoot, and this mission may not yield favorable results. And therefore, he was worried that Yehoshua, or Hosea, who was at the time, who was Moshe's valet, he was his talmid, he was his attendant and his close disciple. Moshe realized that he was at risk of the influence of the others, of the other spies, because of his humility. His righteousness is unquestioned, but his humility in this context brings with it a vulnerability as well. That's how I would like to suggest the meaning. Because of his humility, therefore Moshe realized it's necessary to add the name of God to augment the conviction of Yehoshua. He's righteous, thoroughly righteous, but does he have the total strength of his convictions even against the view and the opinions of 10 other of his compatriots? It's a bit like the rabbi of the small town who is approached by two members of the community with a din Torah. And he sits in his study, and the two men come in, and each one presents his case. The first one argues passionately that he's in the right, and he says to the rabbi says to him, "You're right." The other one says, "Hey, wait a minute, let me have a chance to tell you my point of view." So the other fellow speaks up, and he defends his position with great passion and fervor. And the rabbi, after listening, says, "You're right." So the Rebbitzin is listening from the kitchen, and she says, "Beryl, how can it be? It's not possible that he's right and he's also right. They can't both be right." So he says, "You're also right." So if everybody is right, then where is your conviction? Where do you draw the line and say, "This is my opinion. I'm going to run with it. I'm not going to be swayed by other points of view"? So therefore, the humility of Yehoshua demands or beckons for Moshe to augment him with the addition of the letter Yud for the name of God. I want to tell you, though, by way of conclusion, a final idea that he says about this on the same point, about adding the Yud. So to be exact, Rashi says Moshe prayed for Hosea by calling him Yehoshua, and he said, Hoshiacha, may God save you from the plot of the other spies. Now, the name of God, Yud and Hey, is one of the names of God that is a holy name. It's a name that we find in the Siddur, we find it in the Chumash in certain places. Not such a common name. Actually, let's give a shiur about the subject, and it's not that common. In Tehillim we do find it, but it's a kind of specialized name. There's one memorable place where that name of God appears. I don't mean in the Zemer called Yaribon, but it appears in the Torah. I'll recite the pasuk. I hope you can, it will immediately remind you of where it is. Ki yad al kes yah milchama la'adonai ba'amalek midor dor. The hand is on the throne of God. A battle with Amalek, a battle to God with Amalek for every generation. That pasuk was said, it's at the very end of Parshas Beshalach, after Amalek was defeated in battle. But even though Amalek was defeated, Amalek was not destroyed. A bit like Hamas, they come back to fight another day. Yehoshua led the battle against Amalek. I'm sorry to say he did not deliver a knockout blow. It was maybe a TKO, technical knockout. But Amalek licked his wounds and was there to fight another day and another battle. Says Rashi on that pasuk in Beshalach that this is an unusual term. Yad al Kes. Kes is short for Kisei. The name of God, Yud and Hey, is short for the tetragrammaton. Yud and Hey, Vav and Hey. Says Rashi there, the throne of God is not complete and the name of God is not complete as long as Amalek is still in the world. Now, the Gemara says that when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, they had three mitzvahs that were specific to that time. Actually, it took them a long, long time before they got around to doing them. One of them was appointing a king. The second is destroying Amalek. And the third was building the Beis HaMikdash. It took them actually a few hundred years to even turn their attention to those. But in any case, when Yehoshua brings them into the land of Israel, so the opportunity to destroy Amalek is now on the cards. So that's why Moshe added the letter Yud to the name of Hosea, Yehoshua, in order to evoke the memory of what Hashem had said about Yehoshua or about Amalek previously. And that is that the name of God is not complete until Amalek is destroyed. Yehoshua, you began the task. You rose to the challenge. You led the battle against Amalek. You clobbered Amalek. You defeated Amalek, but you did not destroy Amalek. It wasn't the time, evidently. It doesn't mean Yehoshua was criticized for the shortcoming. The time had not yet arrived for it. Says Rav Yonatan Eibshitz, Moshe changed his name by adding the Yud in order to indicate to Yehoshua You've done very well. You've beaten Amalek, but you've got to finish the job. The name of God is not complete as long as Amalek is in this world. I would just like to say, by way of conclusion, that this, I think, is a challenge, is a charge for Yehoshua, and I would say for all of us as well, for every person, that someone who achieves much, who achieves heroism, who achieves greatness, who achieves, as we would say, godless, can still do more. One can always do better. One can always achieve a great deal, and the next time, the next opportunity, go further. Don't rest on your laurels. Don't feel, well, I've achieved my life's mission. You can always do more. You can always achieve more. You can always learn more. You can always aspire to more. I keep saying I'm ending, but the late Rabbi Dr. Shia Twersky, he died at the age of 90. And even though towards the end of his life, inevitably, his powers were diminished, but he always had that drive. He always had that determination. When he was 70, when he was 80, when he was, in his late 80s, he was still lecturing, publishing. He was still writing articles and books. He always felt there's more to do. Whatever I've achieved, I can achieve more. I must achieve more. This is why Moshe changed the name of Hosea, adding the Yud. Remember Yehoshua. Remember what you achieved. You achieved half the name of God. There's more to do. Thank you very much. And I wish everybody Shabbat Shalom. If there are any questions, happy to take them.